This message is brought to you by Moody and the Worship Center Christian Church, where we are committed to honoring God, unifying communities, and building people. We hope you enjoy this message, and thank you for supporting our ministry.
I hope you're excited about receiving the word today. I'm excited to share it with you. We have been in a series of teaching based on my new book that came out last month, Desired by God, and I've just been really sharing one section of the book because we have been journeying to really understand the heart of God. In fact, that's the first section of Desired by God. The section title is Who is God Really? And that's been what I've been led to share with you. And so I want to go back to where we have been for the last several weeks. I want you to meet me in Hebrews chapter 8 and verse 6. Hebrews 8 and verse 6. And then we're going to flip over to Acts chapter 13 and look at one verse in verse 22. Hebrews chapter 8 and verse 6. If you have been with us throughout this entire series, you may even know this verse by heart because we've been looking at it for the last several weeks. Hebrews 8 and 6 says, "But in fact, the ministry that Jesus has received is as superior to theirs as the covenant of which he is mediator is superior to the old one, since the new covenant is established on better promises." One translation says that Jesus hath obtained a more excellent ministry founded upon a better covenant. And then really quickly look at Acts 13 and verse 22, and this is going to be the context out of which we're going to take the next step in the series this morning. Talking about David, it says, after removing Saul, this is Acts 13 and verse 22, he made David their king. And God testified concerning him. And listen to what God says about David. "I have found David, son of Jesse, a man after my own heart." As we take this next step in the series, Desired by God, I want to talk today for a few moments about how David is desired by God. Now, we have every week been looking at Hebrews 8 and 6 because it really is the foundation, the basis for which this entire series has been built upon, and I really go into depth and explain it in greater detail in the book Desired by God. But Hebrews 8 and 6 is important because it helps us to understand two critical things. First of all, that the way we react to connect with God, our relationship, our walk, our ability to connect with God is based upon our relationship with Jesus Christ. And it is new, it is unique compared to the other covenants that God had established with mankind prior to Jesus Christ. This verse also suggests that if you're really going to understand why we have this unique, authentic, purposeful, significant connection with God through Jesus, if you're going to really appreciate that, then you've got to go back and understand the covenants that God entered into with man prior to Jesus. And that's really what we've been doing through this series. I've been repeating this every week because I don't want this to be lost on you. I want you to really fully get this. In the Old Testament, God demonstrated his love through the covenants that he entered into with mankind at that time. He manifested himself through those covenantal agreements with humanity. I shared with you that there were several of these covenants, and what we've been doing through this series, we've been walking through them. In the ancient world, particularly in the Old Testament days, and then we see it in its fulfillment with Jesus Christ, God did everything in terms of how he presented himself, how he revealed himself, and how he behaved according to those covenants. In the ancient world, in the Bible days, the communities coexisted based on these covenants. And when they made these covenants, they would say them aloud, they would write them down, they would sign it. And it was this covenantal agreement, this covenantal understanding that would be a binding contract, and it would govern everything about their interaction. And I keep stressing this because, once again, this is where a lot of the misunderstanding about God comes from. Part of the reason that a lot of people look at the Old Testament in particular and misunderstand the heart of God and misinterpret his actions is because what people don't realize is that God was acting, behaving in line with the covenantal agreements that he made with man at that time. And this series is so important because I've been saying it throughout the weeks, and I'll say it again. One of the easiest ways to understand the Bible, apart from all 66 books and all the details, is what I've been teaching you, is to understand how God revealed himself covenantally. Because the Bible is not just a story of God's history with man. It's not just a story of the nation of Israel, God's chosen people. It's a story of how God walked with humanity, how God revealed himself to humanity through those covenantal agreements. And in previous weeks, I started unpacking this. There were 3 types of these covenants. Are you following me? You still with me? There were 3 types of these covenants. The first covenant is a grant covenant. Somebody say grant covenant. Yeah, we've been kind of transforming Sunday morning into an in-depth walk through Scripture because I want you to get this. The Bible says we perish because of lack of knowledge, or in all thy getting, get understanding. And that's part of where we've gone wrong and why we've misrepresented God to a hurting and dying world, because we don't have understanding. Amen? And so I've been intentional to try to walk you through this. The first is a grant covenant, and there's an image that we've been looking at where there's an outstretched hand that represents the hand of God, and there's that little man in the center, and God is literally saying, I got you. Why? Because a grant covenant was when a greater party, which represents God, and a lesser party would come into an agreement. And the greater party, God, would take on all of the obligations, and all the lesser party had to do was receive the covenant and simply trust God. So we saw this with Noah. We saw this with Abraham. Incidentally, this is the kind of covenant that God enters into with Adam and Eve. I didn't have time to even show that to you. But we see this grant covenant with Noah. You see it with Abraham. But then we looked at the fact that when you get to Moses and the nation of Israel in Exodus 19, everything changes. God shows up on Mount Sinai and tells Moses, you tell the people to consecrate themselves because I'm going to come down and meet with them. And it was the intention of God to give the nation of Israel a grant covenant like he had established with Abraham, like he had established with Noah. But we looked a few weeks ago at what happened. God shows up. They are afraid. Fear sets in. And instead of choosing relationship with God through a grant covenant, they choose rules. They say to Moses, you go back up there, you meet with God, you tell us what he said, rules, and then we will follow them. And on last week, Pastor Quentin took us even further in a very powerful way about how damaging fear can be. How we see fear is what separated the children of Israel from what God had originally intended, a grant covenant. So instead of a grant covenant, the children of Israel enter into something totally different, something called a kinship covenant. A kinship covenant is a different illustration. You see the hand of God, and you see that little man, and you see those tablets right there in between. That's an illustration of a kinship covenant. A kinship covenant was the second type of ancient covenant, and a kinship covenant was more about rules than relationships, and the rules were divided between two parties, and it was really like a business contract. And that's what the 10 Commandments literally are. I shared with you some weeks ago that many of us have this Charlton Heston version of the Ten Commandments when we think that there were 2 tablets, 5 on one side and 5 on the other. But Exodus 32 tells us differently. There were 2 tablets, but each tablet was written on the front and the back. Why? Because it was a kinship covenant ceremony. It was really like an old school carbon copy. God had his set, saying, this is what I agree to. The nation of Israel had their set. But even though they ask for a kinship covenant, they say, Moses, we are scared, we're afraid. You go up to the mountain, you come down, give us the rules, and we'll follow them. Even though they asked for a kinship covenant, I shared with you that it was a grant covenant that came from the heart of God. It was a kinship covenant that came from the heart of the people. But even though they asked for a kinship covenant, here is the thing you got to understand. It still wasn't enough. Let me explain it this way. In a couple of days, our country will remember the tragic events that took place on September 11th, 2001. And most people remember where they were when news of those airplanes hitting the World Trade Center became public. And as a result of those attacks, if you traveled back then and you travel now, you know that everything changed. As a result of those attacks, the golden age of air travel, it's come to an end. I remember when my mother used to be able to walk me to the gate. You might remember that? You used to be able to walk your loved one to the gate and wave goodbye and see the plane backing up and all of that. Well, all of that changed after September 11th. Because after September 11th, the federal government created the TSA, the Transportation and Security Administration, and they introduced all of these laws and rules that were intended to keep us safe in air travel. So what am I trying to teach you? After September 11, 2001, all of these rules were introduced because everything changed as it relates to air travel. Similarly, when the nation of Israel reject God's offer for a grant covenant and say, just give us the rules, everything changed. Now, if you remember the rest of the events that took place in 2001, then you remember that a couple of months later in December, there was a disheveled-looking man by the name of Richard Reed who boarded a plane headed for Miami, and he had plastic explosives in the bottom of his shoes. He wore these kind of bulky-looking hiking boots, if you will, and hollowed out in the heel of his shoes were plastic explosives. And so he tried to detonate another bomb on a plane in December, and his attempt didn't work. He was thwarted, and people jokingly called him the shoe bomber. But here's the point. Because of his attempt to bring down that plane, guess what happened? More rules were added. So now we're getting adjusted to all of the new rules that happened as a result of September 11, 2001. And then the TSA adds more rules and said, and by the way, take off your shoes when you're coming through security. Nobody will be able to just wear their shoes anymore because we're going to scan your shoes to make sure that there aren't any more plastic explosives in your shoes. I tell you that story because the kinship covenant that the nation of Israel had with God only went so far. Several things began to happen. First of all, Moses got older. If you keep reading, you recognize that Moses gets older and God allows him to look out and see the promised land, but Moses can't enter into it. And so God says, you're going to have to find a successor. And we know, if you know your Bible history, that Moses ultimately chooses Joshua. But here's the important piece. Moses was God's covenant partner because remember, God wanted the entire nation of Israel to be a royal priesthood and a holy nation and set apart. But they say, no, we don't want none of that, Moses. You go up there and meet with God and just tell us what he said. So God enters into covenant with Moses on behalf of the nation. Moses was God's covenant partner. But now that Moses is getting ready to die, well, guess what? God needs another covenant partner. And so Joshua is the successor, but Joshua also becomes God's new covenant partner. But according to ancient Near Eastern Bible history, whenever two parties were in an agreement and they're getting ready to enter into a new agreement, they would often take time and review, well, let's just see how y'all did with the old agreement. Kind of like before you sign another contract with somebody that you've done some work with, you're going to say, well, let's review how you did the last time we had a contract. And we know how the children of Israel did the entire 40 years that they were under Moses' leadership. They violated every law and rule that they had entered into with God. Even before Moses comes down the mountain with the 10 Commandments, they had already started to violate them. So now when Joshua comes to power, and Joshua becomes God's new covenant partner in addition to the new leader of the nation of Israel, something very, very important happens. In the book of Deuteronomy, God initiates a new covenant with Joshua. And this time, the covenant is downgraded. It is downgraded to something called a vassal covenant. It's not grant. That's what God really wanted. They rejected that. They have kinship under Moses. But then as they get ready to review it, because Moses is getting ready to die, Joshua is coming to power, God says, now, you guys asked for a kinship covenant, and you did not adhere to it for 40 years. So this time, we're going to do something called a vassal covenant. A vassal is totally different. You see the hand of God saying, now, you're going to do this or else. God is saying, now, here are the rules if you're going to stay in covenant with me. If you're going to walk with me, I'm a holy God. There's some things that I won't even tolerate anymore. This is a vassal covenant. A vassal covenant is the third and the final ancient covenantal agreement. A vassal is somebody who receives protection, right, from a greater party. They receive provision. In return, though, they have to fulfill a set of obligations. A vassal covenant is not between two equal people. There is a lord, a king, and there are subjects. So when Joshua becomes the new leader of the nation of Israel, Joshua is not meeting on equal ground like Moses met with God on equal ground, because the children of Israel had done a terrible job for the last 40 years of following the kinship covenant. So now more rules are added. I'll show this to you. Look at Deuteronomy chapter 31. It says in verse 24, after Moses finished writing in a book the words of this law from the beginning to end, he gave this command to the Levites who carried the ark of the covenant of the Lord. Take this what? Book of the law. And that's not a trick question. You're like, book. Take this book of the law and place it where? Beside the ark of the covenant of the Lord your God. There it will remain as a witness against you. So what's in the covenant? What's in the ark of the covenant? The 10 Commandments. One set of laws. So now God says, all right, Moses, I've given you additional laws. You're getting ready to die. But for Joshua and the rest of the nation, these are the additional laws. And Moses says to the Levites, y'all place them beside the ark. So there are laws, the 10 Commandments, in the ark. There are additional laws, this whole book of laws, besides the ark. These book of laws, this is what the book of Leviticus and the book of Deuteronomy is. And I'm taking my time to walk you through this because the book of Deuteronomy and the book of Leviticus, out of all of the books of the Old Testament particularly, have caused more people to misunderstand the heart of God than any other book. There are so many individuals who used to be believers, have descended into atheism or have become agnostic, largely because they do not understand the laws and the rules that are set up and spoken of, communicated through Deuteronomy and Leviticus. And if we could be real, when you're reading through the Bible like we do every year, you're like, ooh, Exodus, interesting story. And you get to Leviticus and you're like, I'm going to just skip that. And because it's rule after rule after rule after rule. And there are a number of people who've read these rules and they're like, well, wait a minute now. If that's God, I don't want to have anything to do with him. There are people who read some of these rules and think, well, wait a minute. Is God okay with slavery? Is God okay with the mistreatment of women? Is God okay with families being torn apart and foreigners being treated horribly? Is God okay with that? And the answer is no. But a lot of people misunderstand the heart of God in these particular books, starting from Exodus 19, going through Deuteronomy, because they don't understand the context. And interestingly enough, this is also where a lot of leaders come from who think that it is okay to represent God and to spew hate and condemnation. Because if you ask them, well, where did you get that from? Oh, you can't, you got a tattoo. You can't come up into the house of God. You got to look a certain way. You can't wear any makeup. You can't have earrings in your hair. All of that stuff. Where did you get that from? You know where they're going to point? Well, if you go back to post-Exodus 19, and it's going to go to Leviticus, it's going to go to Deuteronomy. The Bible said that's sure enough what the Bible say right there. Yeah, but you don't understand the context. This is also why there are a number of people who are fundamental believers, hardcore believers, and they think, well, we just need to take our government back to reflecting the laws of Moses. And there are people who right now, today in 2018, will argue that our country will be better if we just go back and lift up these laws because that is what God said. Yeah, that is what he said, but that's not his heart. That's not what God originally intended. That is not God's ideal. Well, how do you know that? Well, because God's ideal is clear. Look at the Garden of Eden. When Adam and Eve sinned, God doesn't just drop the hammer and say, gone off with your head. No. God sacrifices an animal so that they are covered. God comes walking through the Garden of Eden saying, where are you? Even their sin doesn't separate them from God. God's ideal is on display in Adam and Eve, with Noah, and with Abraham, and even with David. Even with David. So here's what I want you to see. From Abraham, Genesis 12, Genesis 15, through Exodus 19. 2,847 years go by, nearly 3,000 years before the law ever comes into existence. The only way that people related to God was grant covenant. Just trust me. After Exodus 19, when they reject the grant covenant, enter into a kinship covenant, it is later downgraded to a vassal covenant. From Exodus 19 all the way to Jesus, 1,300 years. So get this. There are more than twice as many years where there wasn't the rules and the laws, you got to do this, you got to do that, actually more than twice as many years without the law as there were with the law. This is also part of the reason why when Jesus comes and he begins to do earthly ministry, and he is literally showing us in high definition who God is and what the heart of the Father is. The Pharisees and the Sadducees don't understand it. They don't get it. They think, man, you have bumped your head. You've lost your mind. That clearly can't be God. Why? Because they were still adhering to all of those laws that flowed into existence starting in Exodus 19. Jesus comes and he violates the law. Jesus says, I didn't come for those who are well. I came for the sick. Jesus is hanging out with prostitutes and folk that are considered unclean. He's like, hey, at the party, hey, mama said, baby, we ran out of wine. Jesus said, I got you, mama. Boom. Keep the party going. And the Pharisees are like, we don't, this cannot be God. Because they are still following these Mosaic laws that were in effect for literally 1,300 years. But remember, that wasn't God's original ideal. His original ideal was a grant covenant. And here's how powerful this 13-year period is, because sandwiched in between these 1,300 years, from Exodus 19 to when Jesus begins his earthly ministry, sandwiched in between these 1,300 years, while everybody else is held to a kinship covenant, then it is downgraded to a vassal covenant, God had a special relationship with David. This is so good. I want you to get this. The very first thing that's said about David, even before he is anointed, 1 Samuel 13 and 14, it says that he was a man after his own heart. It says that the Lord has sought out a man after his own heart and appointed him ruler of his people. Talking about David. Before David is anointed, this is the first thing that God says about him. He's a man after my own heart. Sandwiched right in the middle of this 13-year period, kinship downgraded to vassal, is David. And the theme of David's life is he was a man after God's own heart. Before he was anointed, that's what was said about him. Long after he had died and gone on to glory in Acts 13 that we read a moment ago, when the apostles are talking about the life of David, that's what they say about him. He was a man after God's own heart. He's trusted God and loved God to such a degree, watch this, that in the middle of a vassal covenant era, while everybody else was held to a vassal covenant, you better do this or else, God rolled it back just for David. And God established just for David a grant covenant. So here we go. We're back to the grant covenant. Just trust me. I got you. While everybody else had all of these rules, while everybody else had to adhere to all of these rules, God says, no, David, just trust me. Just trust me. I get a chance with you, David, to do what I really wanted to do. I get a chance with you, David, and stay with me because we're going to Jesus in the next 2 weeks, and it's going to all come together. So stay with me. God says to David, this is what I've wanted the whole time. This is what I had with Noah. This is what I had with Abraham. This is what I really wanted with the children of Israel. But they didn't want it. They rejected it. They didn't adhere to even what they asked for. But because you trust me, because you love me, I'm going to establish it with you. I got 3 amens right there, and that's fine. Some of you are like, I didn't get it. I was here a couple of weeks. I missed a few weeks. Well, let me remind you. A grant covenant is not based on your performance. Grant covenant is not based on your perfection. A grant covenant doesn't have kind of if you don't screw up clause. No. And I know that this is probably radical for some of you because the one thing that you first have got to remember, at least acknowledge, number one, is David's issues. So many of us, particularly if you grew up in a traditional church environment, you came up in a culture that drilled these rules into you. You got to do this, you got to dress a certain way, you got to act a certain way. But then wait a minute then, how do you explain David? Because David sure enough had issues. Yeah, he had it. David was far from perfect. If sin could have disqualified David from a relationship with God, then all of his mistakes and all of his mess ups would have been an issue and would have provided really just suggested or created a serious problem in his interaction between God and David, because David had tons of issues. What kind of issues are you talking about, Pastor? Some of you thinking, well, I don't remember my Sunday school teacher telling me about David's issues. Well, let's talk about him for a quick second. First of all, you got to deal with the fact that he was an adulterer. You can't gloss over that he was on the roof one day and looks down and sees this beautiful woman bathing and says, I got to have her. Even though she was married and he had other wives. He said, no, I got to have her. He was an adulterer. But then you've got to also deal with, not only was he an adulterer, but he was an accomplice to murder. Because after he sleeps with Bathsheba, now the issue is, okay, now what am I going to do about her husband? Because I can't do only one full one night. I want you. So y'all catch that on Tuesday. So David concocts a scheme. He's an accomplice to murder. He tells his army general, take her husband, take Uriah, put him on the front lines of the battle where the battle is the fiercest because he's going to die. David is an adulterer. David is an accomplice to murder. But David also wasn't a good father. He wasn't a good father. He has a son named Amnon who was in love with his sister Tamar, so much so that he rapes her. And the Bible says that when David finds out, he was furious, but David there's no record of David having a conversation with Amnon or with Tamar. That doesn't say, baby, I'm so sorry that this happened to you. I mean, there's no conversation. In fact, the one who speaks up for Tamar is David's other son, Absalom. And Absalom turns around and kills Amnon and ends up taking Tamar into his house. But there's no record of David inserting himself. Maybe he was too busy going after his career and climbing the corporate ladder and fighting battle after battle and his agenda at hand. But he wasn't the kind of father he needed to be for his children. And not only that, he was a horrible parent, because now Absalom has got an issue with his dad. I can't believe my dad didn't do anything. I can't believe the king, supposed to be so anointed, didn't do anything about it. So Absalom takes matters into his own hands. And not only does he care for his sister, but he kills his brother Amnon, and then he comes after his own father. And never is there a place recorded in history where David even goes to Absalom and says, son, I know you're mad. I know you're angry. I know that I wasn't the kind of father I should have been. I was too busy with other things. And I just want you to know I'm sorry. And I want you to not follow in my footsteps and make some of the mistakes I made. There's no record of that kind of interaction. David was an adulterer. He was an accomplice to murder. He was a horrible father. He was not a good parent. But yet he was a man after God's own heart. Oh, I want you to wrestle with this. Despite all of his mistakes, God, I love your word. Despite all of the ways that he dropped the ball, it didn't interrupt his relationship with God. And if David could make all of those mistakes and still be a man after God's own heart, then why can't you? If David could make all of those mistakes, and his mistakes didn't disqualify him from his relationship with God, then what makes you think that your mistakes or somebody else's mistakes, this thinking that, well, no, so you can do that and God will forgive you, but you can't do that, that's not in the Bible. I wish I could even have time to unpack even this whole notion of, well, if you commit suicide, it separates you from God. Where does that come from? This may be too much for some of y'all. I hope I didn't lose you. But if we could cause theocide, which is worse than suicide. Theocide, Theocide is when we kill God. If he could be on the cross and we were killing him, and he say, Lord, forgive them, for they don't know what they do. Oh, I lost some of y'all. Okay. David's life, while it encompassed great success, it also was marked by great failure. Lord help me, I'm looking at the time. I don't know if I have enough time to even do any of this. Here's what I want to show you, and I'll show you really quickly. I won't have time to really unpack this. Maybe get the message from the earlier service. I wanted you to see David's issues. I wanted you to see it. Because despite all of his issues, he still was a man after God's own heart. Why? Because it wasn't about his perfection, grant covenant. It wasn't about him crossing every T, dotting every I, grant covenant. It was about, can you trust me? Do you love me? And David trusted God. David loved God. Despite his flaws, despite his mistakes, he went all in with God. And I'll give you a couple of examples of that. And I really struggled, if I could be transparent with you, I really struggled this week praying and saying, well, God, I know it's just what you want me to share, but Lord, how do I do this in such a short period of time? Because apart from David's failures, you can look at his life in any aspect and see his radical love for the Lord. See his radical trust. I mean, it bleeded out everything that he was and he did. But there's one encounter that maybe quickly I can show you, and that's this encounter between him and Goliath. Because I want you to see how much he trusted God. David trusted God. David believed God to the degree that David even trusted and believed, number one, that God is bigger than our biggest problems. He trusted that God, you're bigger. What do you get this from? Well, in 1 Samuel 17, it says a champion named Goliath, who was from Gath, came out of the Philistine camp, and his height was 6 cubits and a span. And it goes on. I don't have time, but it talks about his coat of armor and talks about his javelin. And the Bible takes the time to walk us through how massive Goliath was. Because God says, I want you to pay attention to that. But see how big he was. Because for 39 days, Goliath would come out, big, massive, giant, and he'd hurl insults at the nation of Israel. And for 39 days, when he'd come out, they start running away. And it just so happened that on the 39th day, actually it was the 40th day, David is coming into the camp and hears this, and he's like, whoa, wait a minute. Why y'all running? Why y'all scared? Isn't it interesting that this is not the normal behavior for the nation of Israel? In every other battle, they would run into battle. They would say, come on, let's get it. But then because of how big Goliath was, instead of running into the battle, they would run away. You missed it. Isn't that how we do? When the problem is the size that we think we can manage, when the problem is the size that we think, well, I can take care of that, or my gift or my ingenuity or my connections can help me with that, then we run into battle. But when we encounter a problem that is bigger than anything we've encountered before, we run away. Oh, y'all don't want to talk to me this morning? It's interesting how we can believe God for a car, right? You know, or a good interest rate. Oh, praise God. I just want you to know, Pastor, favor the Lord. Hey, he hooked this car up. But then you get the diagnosis of cancer. And you act like, oh, Pastor, I need you to pray for me because I don't, you know what the doctor said, and I just need the prayer warriors to come around and pray because, I don't know what to do. Wait a minute, you were just shouting over the car. You were just shouting favor because you got 0.5 off your interest rate. So where did the same favor for the car go when the diagnosis has just gotten bigger? Oh, yeah. It's interesting how we will run into battle when it's something we think we can manage, but when it's a big thing, we start running away. David says, wait a minute. David says, no. The size of the problem might change, but God has not changed. And I don't know who this is for. But here's what you need to know. The way you respond to the problem is an indication of how big you think your God is. And if you run away in the face of a big problem, then apparently you really don't know how big God is. God is bigger than your biggest problem. He's bigger than politics. He's bigger than race. He's bigger than whoever is your boss that doesn't recognize your talent. He's bigger than that. He's bigger than, well, I don't know the right person to open the right door for me. He's bigger than that. He's bigger than my resume doesn't give me the right to step in the room. He's bigger than that. He's bigger than, well, my credit doesn't qualify me for that type of interest rate and that type of loan. He's bigger than that. High five somebody, tell him he's bigger than that. He's bigger. He holds the world in the palm of his hands. The earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof, and they that dwell therein. The earth is his footstool. He's bigger. Let me leave this alone. He's bigger. He's bigger. He's bigger. He's bigger. Somebody needs to upgrade their perspective. Woo! God is bigger than that, baby. He's bigger. I need you to dream a little bit bigger because the God we serve is big. Can I tell you what we do? I'm trying to hurry up. Let me tell you what we do. And this is an indication of how big God is to you, because here's what we normally do. When there's a big problem, tell you what we do. We gaze at the problem in our behavior, in our speech. We gaze at the problem, and then we have the nerve while we're gazing at the problem to glance at God. I'm over here saying God is bigger. You're like, oh, yeah, that's cute. But do you see this? Do you understand how big this is? No, do you understand how big God is? Instead of gazing at your problem and glancing at God, you got to turn this thing around. You got to gaze at God. I look toward the hills from which comes my help. God never said to focus on your problem. He says, focus on me. Oh, magnify the Lord with me. Gaze at God and glance at your problems. Oh, that ain't nothing for God. Oh, that ain't nothing for God. Hallelujah. Come on, don't do that, man. I'm just trying to teach. Y'all sit down, 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 sit down. David comes into the battle and says, wait a minute, what are y'all running for? You don't understand how big he is. I know how big he is. But David runs into battle. And can I tell you something? Anything worthwhile is uphill. Can I tell you that? Anything worthwhile is uphill. This is part of the reason, Lord help me. This is part of the reason why so many of the mighty moves of God happen where? On top of a mountain. When Abraham gets a revelation that the Lord is a provider, where does that happen? On top of the mountain. Which means he's got to be willing to climb that bad boy. You missed it. When fire falls from heaven and Elijah takes on the 450 false prophets of Baal, where does that happen? On top of a mountain. Which means he's got to be willing to climb that bad boy. Some of us, when we see the size of the mountain, we start running away. But an indication of what God has for you is what you got to go through to get it. You missed it. So if God didn't have something great for you, you wouldn't have that mountain to climb. So David comes to battle and says, well, wait a minute. God's got promise for me. God has made a promise to the nation of Israel going all the way back to Abraham in Genesis 12. So yes, it's a big problem, but I guess that's what I got to go through to get to what God has for me. Who is this for? If you're in a season and you're like, well, God, I don't understand why this is big, and I don't understand why I'm having this problem, because God's got something big for you. That ought to be an indication that you're on the right track. Not that it's a time to retreat. If it was easy, it wouldn't be God. So God, David trusts God so much that David says to God, I trust that you are bigger than my biggest problem. But wait a minute. He also trusts that God, you're bigger than my family drama too. You're bigger than my family drama. I just want to show you glimpses of how passionately David loved and trusted God. He said, you're bigger than my family drama. When David stumbles into the battlefield, it says in 1 Samuel 17 and 28, it says, when Eliab, David's oldest brother, heard him speaking with the men, he burned with anger and said, why have you come down here? And with whom did you leave those few sheep in the wilderness? I know how conceited you are, how wicked your heart is. You came down here only to watch the battle. Jesus says that often a man's enemies will come from his own family. That's not Pastor Van, that's Jesus. That's the gospel. David is inquiring about this big problem, and he says, I believe that God can take care of this. And his oldest brother speaks up and says, man, come on. Go back to your little few sheep. Look how demeaning he is. And it even starts before he gets to the battlefield. Because when Samuel comes to anoint the next king of Israel, and he gets to Jesse's house, David is Jesse's youngest son. Jesse doesn't even think enough of David to include him when the prophet, the man of God, comes looking for those whom he's supposed to anoint. What David's father does is David's father chooses all 7 of David's older brothers. Doesn't even think of David enough to say, well, I got another son out in the field. Let me go get him. He doesn't even give David a thought. Sometimes the biggest burden that we will carry is not the burden from the world, it's the burden from our family. And I don't know who this is for, but for some of us, that's the burden. You have been carrying this burden of the expectation you had for your family to support you. But the greatest hate that you've had came from your family. And you've been carrying this burden of what your family has said, or even what your family didn't do. They didn't think enough about you to speak life to you. They didn't support your dream. They didn't tell you that you could be anything. They didn't see and recognize what God was trying to do. And so many of us feel like we have been out here on our own. I don't know who I'm teaching to. I'm teaching to somebody. But I want you to understand that God is even bigger than that. He's bigger than that. He's bigger than that. He's bigger than that. This is part of the reason why Jesse thought it was a slight on David. Oh, David ain't nothing. He don't need to be in here. But God sovereignly set it up this way. Because David, listen to me, has 7 older brothers. 7 is the number of completion. So God says, I want you to go through all 7, and I want you to recognize that none of them will have the anointing fall on them. Because David is number 8. There's a whole new thing that God is getting ready to do. Do you hear what I'm trying to tell you? And some of you have been burdened because you feel like your family didn't recognize what was on your life. It's because you were not called to follow in their footsteps. God said, I love your family, but their lineage, their way of life, their way of thinking, I brought to an end. With you, I'm doing something totally new. With you, I'm doing something totally different. So you had to be on the outside. Because if you were accepted by them, you would follow them. God is bigger. God's bigger than your biggest problem. He's bigger. He's bigger than your family drama. He's bigger than even the past. I don't have time. He's bigger than the past. David says, I'm gonna go face this dude. In 1 Samuel 17, verse 38, it says that Saul tried to put on his armor on David. Saul dressed David in his own tunic, coat of armor on him, bronze helmet on his head. David fastened his sword over his tunic and tried walking around because he wasn't used to them. He says, I can't go. So I can't go in these. Listen to me very carefully. God is bigger than the past, y'all. If you really understand how big God is, if you really trust him, you won't keep rehearsing your past. This is the symbolism of Saul trying to make David wear his armor, because in the mind of Saul, well, that's the way that we fight. That's the way we fought for years, so that's the way you have to fight. That's the way we've handled money for years, so that's the way you got to handle money. That's the way we've done marriages in this family for years, so that's the way you got to do marriage. This is the way we've parented for years, so this is the way you've got to parent. And so many of us just rehearse whatever was in our past. We try to get to God by serving him leftovers. But I want you to hear me. This is not the time for you to recycle and refurbish and redo what God has done in the past. The dominant cry of your heart ought to be, God, what are you doing right now? I need to experience what you're saying right now. Because Jesus says he's not going to pour new wine in old wineskins. So you cannot want new wine, but what you keep holding out is old wineskins. Well, we sang that song before and the Lord moved, so let's sing it again. But what is God doing now? Well, this is the way I ran the business 5 years ago. But what is he saying right now? In Isaiah, God says, behold, I'm doing a new thing. It springs up. Do you not perceive it? Meaning, it's not that you're waiting on me to do the new thing. The new thing is being done right in front of you. But if you have an old mentality, if you have an old way of thinking, if you don't change your perspective, you're going to miss the new thing, and it's happening right in front of you. I'm teaching better than you're responding. David says, I can't go in this armor. I can't follow the traditional pattern because I think God's bigger than the past. I think God is bigger. You learn from your past, but you don't live by it. I think God is bigger. I think God is bigger. This is what David is saying. God, I trust you. Even God, I trust you, and you're bigger than my weakness. Man, He picks up his slingshot. Listen to me. 5 stones. It's symbolic of his weakness. Nobody went into battle with a slingshot, not against a giant. No, that's not the way you fight. You fight with a sword. You fight with a shield. You have an army around you. It was just David. David says, no, this is what I have. Listen, and he trusts God so much that he believes that what I have, listen to me, is good enough for God to get victory and glory out of it. David, listen to me. David doesn't go into battle saying, man, if I have to go like this, I guess. But man, if I had a sword, I could probably really do something. Or man, if I had a good benefactor, I could really do something. Or man, if somebody would open the door for me, then finally I'd be discovered and I could really do. He didn't go to battle that way. He says, God, this is what you've given me. And while it may look like a weakness to others, I know when I take my weakness and put it in your hands, your strength is made perfect in my weakness. I don't know who this is for, but here's what you got to remember. Where you stop is where God begins. God says, I will make up the difference between where you are, what you have, and what you ultimately need. He goes out with the slingshot and 5 smooth stones, and everybody's laughing at him, but he trusts God. And God takes that one stone. See, with God, all you need is to be in his will. And he'll take, the Bible says, even the foolish things of the world to confound the wise. That God says, I don't need a whole bunch of stuff. I just need somebody that's going to trust me and believe that even if I tell them to do something that doesn't make sense to anybody else, I will use that for my glory. Now I'm going to stop here because I'm well over my time. But I just wanted you to get a glimpse of how flawed David was. But yet he trusted God. Here's one of the last ways that I'll show you that David really loved God and really trusted him. David believed that something big happens when you worship. David's whole life was marked by worship. And if you want to know how in the world was David able to handle the ridicule of his family and the ostracism of people, and even when he started serving Saul, the hatred of Saul and having to run from his life because the man he served was trying to kill him. How did David deal with all of that? He worshiped. From the very beginning, David was a worshiper. And here's what you have to understand. Real worship is not just something you do. It's literally the depths and the cry of your heart saying, God, I cannot live without you. I cannot stand to be separate from you. Real worship is not something you just put on Sunday and take off on Sunday afternoon. David was a worshiper. This is why so many of his love songs have been captured in the Bible, and they're Psalms, and we read them today, and we read of a man who was passionately in love with God. But the thing I want you to see is in 2 Samuel 6 and verse 17. Musicians, if y'all waiting on anything, I'll pass that, please. Come on. I'm ended. Because once again, I told you, in all that getting, get understanding. I don't want you to just shout about something and not know what you're shouting about. I want your heart to capture this, probably more so than your mind. I want your mind to get it too. In 2 Samuel 6, verse 17, this is the first act, really, that David institutes when he finally comes to power, when he is anointed king over all of Israel. David says, we got to go get the ark. Because the ark had been captured by the Philistines. There was no glory, because the glory of the Lord dwelled in between the cherubim on the top of the ark, which is the mercy seat. The Philistines that captured the ark, David says the first thing we got to do is we got to go back and get the ark. We got to go back. We got to go and get it. We got to go and get it. Now, here's what's so profound about this. Under the kinship, vassal agreement, covenant, there's the tabernacle of Moses. And in the tabernacle of Moses, there's an outer court, inner court, holy of holies. In the tabernacle of Moses, priests have got to come to the brazen altar. Then they got to go to the brazen laver and wash. Then they got to go into the inner court. And it's a busy thing. They got to keep the lampstand burning. They got to keep baking fresh bread for the table of showbread. They got to keep the altar of incense going, because the altar of incense represented the prayer and praise of God's people. And then only one day a year, on the Day of Atonement, was the high priest able to go behind the veil into the Holy of Holies, because the Holy of Holies was where the Ark of the Covenant was. And on the Day of Atonement, the high priest would come in with the blood of a lamb, and he sprinkled the blood on the mercy seat, because the glory of God was right there on top of the ark, looking down in the ark at all of the laws that they haven't kept. And the only thing that kept God from breaking out in judgment, because this was what they wanted in terms of these rules, was the blood of the lamb being sprinkled. Are you following me? I'm trying to rush. But the ark, listen to me, was captured. So now you got people going through the motions. Outer court, sacrificing lambs, brazen laver, washing themselves. Inner court, candlestick, table of showbread, altar of incense. But there's no ark behind the veil. So they're going through the rituals of worship, but there's no glory. It's a picture of people who just come to church on Sunday and say, well, this is just what we do for 15 minutes before Pastor Van teaches, but their heart's cry is not for God. They were going through the motions, but there was no glory. David comes to power. Listen to me. David says, we're going to go get the ark. We can't do nothing apart from the glory of God. David was so in love with God. He said, God, I cannot happen. I can't lead. I can't do what you call me to do without your glory. So when David goes to get the ark, he brings it back, but he doesn't put it in Moses' tabernacle. The verse we just read said, David, did we read that verse, y'all? Did I skip over? Yeah. All right, here we go. Thank y'all. I'm rushing. 2 Samuel 6 and verse 17. They brought the ark of the Lord, set it in its place inside the what? That David had pitched for it. David sacrificed burnt offerings and fellowship offerings before the Lord. David goes and gets the ark. And he puts it inside of a little tent. Just a little pup tent, just, little TP, little tent. Nothing special. No outer court, inner court, holy of holies. He just puts the ark right into the tent. And David, because of his love and trust for God, because of his heart for worship, is able through worship to step right into the glory of God. He doesn't have to go from the outer court to the inner court. He doesn't have to wait on the Day of Atonement, and he doesn't have to come in with blood saying, Lord, have mercy. No, through his worship, through his heart for God. God says, you can come right into my glory. You can come right into my presence. And it is an Old Testament picture of the access that we have to God through Jesus Christ. That because of what he did on the cross, the veil was torn, which is why worship with the heart that so desires our Father is so important. Because if you would want him like that, and if he showed up like that for David, what will he do in your worship? What would he do in a church that is so on fire for him, that they want him more than they want clothes, more than they want a new house, more than they want stuff? What if the cry of your heart through worship is, God, I want you just that bad. I want you more than what people say about me. I want you more than how my wife is treating me. I want you more than whether or not I get this promotion. I want you more than that, God, because you're bigger than that. And I trust you. I trust you when I don't feel like it. I love you even when I'm not being loved by others. God, I just cry out for you. And I wonder, are there any worshipers in this house? I wonder if there's anybody who's finally gotten to a place where they realize that it's for God I live and for God I die, that I want him more than anything, more than status, more than money, more than position. God, my heart is for you. Are there any worshipers in the house like that? Are there any worshipers in the house like that? Are there any worshipers in the house like that? When that's the cry of your heart, you can't put a time limit on worship. When that's the cry of your heart, you can't put a time limit on the flow of God. When that's the cry of your heart, you don't care who's in front of you, who's behind you, who's watching you. Your heart is, God, we're going to give you all the glory, all the honor. When that's the cry of your heart, you can have worship by yourself. When that's the cry of your heart, nobody's got to be on the stage. You can be in your car and just start giving him glory, and the glory of the Lord will fill your car. You can be in your closet and the glory of God will give you all. Yes, God. The glory. Come on. We give you all the glory. We worship you, our Lord. You are worthy to be praised. Come on, one time. We give you all. We give you all the glory. We worship you, our Lord. You are worthy to be praised. Wait a minute. Don't let the worship team worship for you. I want to give you just a few seconds, a few minutes at every campus. If this is the cry of your heart, this may not be for everybody, but if this is the cry of your heart, I want to challenge you to lean into the presence of the Lord. I want to challenge you to set up your pup tent right there on your row and just begin to focus on Him. What do we say? Tell Him how much you love Him. Tell Him how much He means to you. Just let the desire of your heart flow out of your lips. Come on. Lift your voice, worship Him. If you want to come to this altar, you can come. If you want to bow right where you are, you can do it. But let's let worship flow out of the essence of our hearts. God, we want you, 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 we want you. Yeah. Yes. Come on. That's it. Higher, we lift Him higher. That's our cry, God. We want you to be lifted higher.
Jesus, you be lifted
Higher. Yes, God. Higher. Higher than our issues. Higher. Higher. Higher than our worries, God. Higher than our ailment, God. Be lifted, God. Be lifted, God. Be lifted, God. Be lifted higher. Be lifted higher. Hallelujah. Be lifted higher.
Jesus, you be lifted higher.
Yes, God. Higher.
Be lifted higher. Let our King be lifted up.
Yes, Jesus.
Let our King be lifted up.
Yes, Lord.
Let our King be lifted up. Let our King be lifted up.
Let our King
Let our King, let our King be lifted up.
lift up your heads, O ye gates, and be ye lifted up, ye everlasting doors, and the King of glory shall come in. Who is the King of glory? The Lord strong and mighty, the Lord mighty in battle.
We hope you enjoyed this message. For more resources, visit theworshipcentercc.org and vanmoody.org. You will also find Van Moody on all social media platforms. Again, we thank you for your support.